Before his imprisonment, Genovese had given numerous interviews, often flanked by his lawyer, denying everything with a cold, calculated demeanor. But in 1958, he offered a rare glimpse into his world to two Australian journalists. This brief but revealing interview was published in the Sydney Morning Herald on Sunday, November 23, 1958, on page 18. It was a stark contrast to the more extensive interviews given by his contemporaries. Frank Costello had graced the front page of Time magazine in 1949, and both Charlie Luciano and Meyer Lansky had shared their stories in interviews and books, offering a glimpse into the murky world of prohibition, union corruption, and the political machinations of the 1950s. Genovese's 1958 interview stands as a rare artifact, a fleeting insight into the mind of one of the most powerful and enigmatic figures in organized crime. It was a moment of revelation before the walls of his empire began to crumble, setting the stage for the downfall of a man who had once been untouchable. Two reporters this week looked into the home life of America's most powerful and best-known gangster. They found that Vito Genovese, the gangster in question, lives in a small weatherboard cottage, which he rents for $100 a month. "Good morning, gentlemen," the gangster welcomed them. Then he explained, "I am very fussy about food, so I do all my own cooking." The reporters were disillusioned by Genovese's surroundings because he was reported to be living in a $40,000 mansion. Instead, they found him in a simply furnished cottage. There was no guard at the house, nor was there a gun in sight. Genovese, known as Mr. Mafia and King of the Rackets, is alleged to have $22 million in European banks. The two reporters who visited him in his home in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, found him in his kitchen, wearing an apron and making chicken cacciatore for lunch. Genovese showed the reporters his wardrobe. It consisted of 5 suits, the last of which was bought 2 years ago, a dozen shirts, and 3 pairs of shoes. Genovese is set to go on trial in a fortnight as the alleged head of an international drug combine. He would not commit himself on the trial, saying, "Gentlemen, it's not that I refuse to answer any questions. I will answer them in detail after the trial. In fact, I will call you fellows." It was Genovese's estranged wife who claimed he hid $32 million in Europe. "Was she right?" the reporter asked. "Women, women, women," said the bespectacled gangster. "What are we going to do with them, gentlemen? This woman lived with me for 20 years. Then she put the blast on me. That is when all my trouble began. She made up a lot of stories about me owning dog tracks, race tracks, power plants in Italy, nightclubs, the Italian lottery, and putting money in safe deposit boxes in Switzerland. Genovese has also been accused of being decorated during World War II by Mussolini, while he was wanted for murder. "I had no relationship with Mussolini," Genovese said indignantly. "I never saw Mussolini except in pictures." Then, on July the 8th, 1958, the first article appeared, detailing what had happened. The headline read, "Suspected Mafia Chief, Gang Boss Nabbed in U.S. Major Crackdown," with pictures of Vito Genovese and Vincent the Chin Gigante placed side by side, and it reads out, "The government last night launched a major crackdown on the underworld by arresting reputed rackets chieftain Vito Genovese for violating federal narcotics laws. Also seized was Vincent, Chin Gigante, a 30-year-old former heavyweight boxer who was acquitted in May of the attempted assassination of gambler Frank Costello. Other arrests were imminent," the government said. Genovese, 61, a long-time underworld figure and reputed head of the U.S. Mafia, the secret Sicilian society, and Gigante, a small-time hoodlum, were seized on the basis of a sealed indictment handed up yesterday by a federal grand jury. The identities of several other leading underworld figures are expected to be disclosed today with the opening of the indictment at the arraignment of Genovese and Gigante. U.S. Attorney Paul W. Williams called the arrest of Genovese one of the most important arrests ever made in this field. Our investigation discloses that Genovese was the hub around which this entire conspiracy revolved, and Gigante was one of his protégés, and a rising star, Williams said. Vito Genovese has long been described as head of the Mafia, which originated in Sicily and whose members include some of the world's most notorious hoodlums. Vincent, Chin, Gigante, a rising star. Williams, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, referred to the unveiling last month of a vast narcotics network with the arrest of 15 men and 3 women. This ring, Williams said, was responsible for the smuggling of hundreds of pounds of narcotics into the United States annually. Federal agents seized Genovese at his home in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, south of New York City. Gigante was arrested 2 hours earlier in a Greenwich Village social club. Williams hailed the crackdown as a move that could drive the Mafia out of business. A delegate to last November's Gangland Convention at Appalachian, New York, Genovese is reputed to be the head of gambling, vice, and waterfront rackets, in addition to his alleged narcotics operations. He has a police record dating from 1917, with arrests on numerous occasions for homicide and felonious assault. Repeatedly, however, the charges have been dropped. On the same day, another article targeted Genovese, this time delving into his personal history, particularly focusing on his wife's statements about him. The gears were turning slowly, with the Justice Department, Senate committee hearings, and various other forces applying increasing pressure on Genovese. A federal grand jury attempting to break through organized crime's tough defenses made a major move against the underworld last week. A jury in New York returned an indictment against Vito Genovese, chief of the Mafia in North America, charging him with being the brains of a huge narcotics ring operating in major cities. If the indictment against America's #1 criminal is sound, Genovese could be on his way out. But the boys in the back room did not rush out and laid odds against the notorious gangster on the basis of the announcement. They have seen him slip the hook too often. The smart money could be wrong, of course, but the men who lay it on the line base their odds-on past performances. The form chart on chubby Genovese shows he has been a consistent frontrunner in his many races with the law. He has had it in the stretch too. Sallow-faced Vito, who looks a little like George Raft and is about as talkative as a tailor's dummy, once was charged with first-degree murder in an iron-clad indictment. Authorities know he gave aid and comfort to Nazi and fascist bigwigs when they were at war with the Allies. And he was caught red-handed near the end of the war using American army trucks to hijack American military supplies, which he sold on the Italian black market for huge profits. He escaped prosecution on all these charges and on others almost as noteworthy. For years he has been living the life of a wealthy country gentleman in a 9-room marble-staired home at Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, not far from his racket headquarters in New York City. All the while, he reportedly has been calling the shots for the Mafia in a wide range of illegal activities, from Shylock lending on the waterfront to importing heroin and other destroying drugs. Genovese has kept going because he knows high-placed officials and because few people have informed on him and lived. One of the few was his wife, Anna, who reacted violently when Vito tried to shed her 5 years ago. She became a classic example of the woman scorned, and Genovese found that is the worst kind. Mrs. Genovese, an attractive brunette with social ambitions, was red-hot with rage when she learned Mr. G had his eye on a younger female, the wife of a Confederate. She blabbed family secrets at the divorce hearing in New Jersey that made law enforcement officers sit up and take notes. The expressive Latin, a youngish-looking grandmother, got right down to cases. She supported her cross-bill for separate maintenance of $350 a week by informing the domestic court judge that Vito earned at least $40,000 a week from narcotics, gambling, waterfront labor rackets, a lottery in New York's Italian district, dog and horse race operations, and a few legitimate interests. He's involved in almost all the rackets, she said. The angry woman claimed she feared death at Genovese's hands, but did not sound like she cared much, the way she talked. Genovese sat quietly in the courtroom and twiddled his thumbs. The testimony made Mrs. Genovese popular in grand jury circles. Everybody investigating the rackets wanted to hear her, including the grand jury that indicted Vito. It was a long time ago that Genovese climbed from the ranks of the local hoodlums to become an international gangster, but he escaped the glare of national publicity until his name began to pop up regularly in hearings of the Senate Crime Investigating Committee in 1950. Even then, he played a secondary role to one of his lieutenants, gravel-voiced Frank Costello. Witness after witness told the committee they had never heard of Vito Genovese. "I don't know the name," said Ralph Bottles Capone, whose late brother Al once headed the National Crime Syndicate. Senator Estes Kefauver's interrogators kept plugging away. They found some hoodlums who admitted having heard of Genovese. One or two even acknowledged an acquaintanceship. The extent of Genovese's operations was pretty well known in the New York area before Kefauver, but in the years since 1950, his ill fame has spread far and wide. Other committees and a few grand juries have called him as a witness. He has claimed constitutional immunity after answering one or two perfunctory questions. About 10 days ago, a voice from the past spoke out against him at a session of the Senate Labor Rackets Investigating Committee in Washington. The voice was that of O.C. Dickey of Altoona, Pennsylvania, a former agent of the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. He spread a large part of the gangster's bloody background on the record. Genovese came to this country from Sicily when he was 15 years old. That was on May 23, 1913. He got into bad company right off the boat. His first arrest came when he was 19. He was picked up for carrying a pistol in 1917 and has been arrested at least 12 times since on such charges as homicide, assault, robbery, murder, carrying concealed weapons, and peddling narcotics. The present-day boss was carrying a pistol for Charles, Lucky, Luciano in the 1930s, when he got into his first really serious trouble. It was evident that he already had risen a cut above the average hoodlum level, because associates always introduced him as Don Vitone, the Great One, in those days. Vito and 5 associates rigged a crooked card game in 1934 and fleeced an unsuspecting but well-heeled merchant of $116,000. The merchant did not squawk, but Vito did when one of his confederates, Ferdinand Boccia, demanded $35,000 for his share of the winnings. Boccia, a gangster known as the Shadow, had crossed Genovese once before. He and another hoodlum, Willie Gallo, had held up an alcohol plant operated by Genovese's friend, Anthony Strollo, in 1932. Vito had been doing a slow burn about that. It just was not in the cards for Boccia to cross Genovese twice. The Great One conferred with his other confederates in the crooked card game, Peter DeFeo, Gus Frasca, George Smura, and Michel Miranda. They condemned Boccia to death. Genovese added to the death warrant the name of Willie Gallo, who had nothing to do with the card game. He hired the condemned Gallo and a friend, Ernest Rupolo, to knock off Boccia. Then he called Rupolo aside and made a separate compact with him. Rupolo, a one-eyed gunman known as the Hawk, was to shoot his friend, Gallo, as soon as Boccia had been ticketed for the city morgue. But Gallo and Rupolo dawdled. Boccia remained alive for several weeks. The Genovese clique hired other gunmen for the job. Boccia finally was shot to death on September 9, 1934. Rupolo, trying to earn at least part of his fee, made a few holes in his friend Gallo with several poorly aimed pistol shots. Gallo lived, and in his disenchantment with fellow thieves, he spilled the story to New York authorities. Genovese, DeFeo, Frasca, Smura, and Miranda skipped town shortly before they were indicted for murder. Genovese and his boss, Luciano, had been doing well in the loan shark business, which used members of Murder Inc. as collectors, and also had infiltrated the labor movement. The first targets were the International Longshoremen's Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. Genovese and Luciano also were making money in the dope and prostitution rackets. Thomas E. Dewey, then district attorney for New York City, changed the happy picture. He cracked down on the rackets and in 1936 obtained a conviction against Luciano. Lucky was sentenced to a term of 30 to 50 years in the state penitentiary. Genovese and friends remained in hiding. The murder case against the five became stronger as the years passed by. Gallo was ready to testify as a state's witness all along. It was not until 1944, 10 years after the murder, that Rupolo decided to place himself on the side of law and order. He had been caught committing another incomplete murder. He fired 5 shots into Carl Sparacino, who continued living. To save his own neck, Rupolo agreed to testify against Genovese and friends. His testimony also added another witness to the state's case, one Peter Latempa, who had observed Boccia's demise. Meanwhile, Genovese had left the United States and returned to his native land. There he had ingratiated himself with another well-known gangster of international repute, Benito Mussolini. Il Duce conferred the title of Commendatore of the Italian Empire on the American racketeer because of a gift of $250,000 to the fascist party in the Nola district of Italy. That is the way Vito bought his way in. The Commendatore is the highest award that can be given to a civilian in Italy. Genovese traveled in high circles in Europe. He dined at state functions with men like Hermann Göring, chief of Germany's Luftwaffe, and Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law. The man who had helped Luciano corrupt the democratic processes in America enjoyed the new associations immensely. Friendship with the totalitarian boys amounted to the same thing as a license to steal. And steal Genovese did. He got control of the Italian Electrical Association through wise investments and used this government power company to force the cooperation of manufacturers and merchants in his black market schemes. He threatened to shut off their electric power if they did not. CID agent Dickey learned about Genovese's activities in an investigation of black market activities behind the American lines in Italy, beginning in April 1944. He uncovered an amazing amount of evidence, but was thwarted at every turn in his attempts to prosecute the Mafia chief. It was rumored at the time that the inquiry was stifled because the exposé would embarrass high-ranking American officers, including a general. Dickey found that Genovese had furled his fascist flag and come running to the Americans when the tide of war brought the Allies into his section of Italy. He was beating his breast with a patriotic fervour. He was not just whistling Dixie either. He was singing a medley that included Home on the Range, God Bless America, and The Star-Spangled Banner. Naive officers of the military government accepted Vito with open arms, particularly when he offered to serve as an interpreter without pay. Captains, majors and colonels gave him certificates that attested to his good morals, honesty and his gallantry. He was given many special considerations not offered to the average enemy. Genovese already controlled Italian wheat and olive oil in Allied-held territory through his machinations with the Power Trust. With his credentials, he also seized control of the black market of stolen American supplies. He operated under the noses of the high brass, even receiving praise from military officialdom by occasionally turning in an independent operator in the black market. Dickey obtained a confession from AWOL Canadian soldiers that they had been hired by someone close to Genovese to steal military supplies. They were dressed in American uniforms, they said, and ordered to drive stolen trucks to a quartermaster supply depot in Naples. The necessary passes were supplied to them. The trucks were loaded with flour and sugar, commodities that brought whopping prices on the black market. The Canadians, who said they repeated the process several times, then drove to a vineyard outside the city of Nola, where they were met by a group of Italians in civilian vehicles. The password that established identification was, "Genovese sent me." The soldiers walked away from the scene as the Italians began reloading the supplies onto their own trucks. The equipment later was burned. Genovese never liked to leave evidence behind. Dickey visited Genovese's sumptuous apartment in Naples and found papers linking him further to the black market conspiracy. He also discovered in the apartment a powerful shortwave radio receiving set, the kind used with long-range transmitters. The transmitter was never located, but it raised the question, had Genovese been a spy too? The question has never been answered, but it is apparent that a man of Genovese's capabilities would not hesitate to sell his country out. There was evidence that Genovese were making profits by illegally circulating money too. The money included gold seal bills, the large, old-fashioned kind that had been retired when the United States went off the gold standard. Other money not legally obtainable in Italy was floating around. American currency of all types was in demand on the black market. Genovese was taken into custody by Dickey, but the inertia of his superiors beat down the energetic investigator when he tried to prosecute Vito in a court. He also discovered that New York officials, including former District Attorney William O'Dwyer, prosecutor of Murder, Inc., seemed unconcerned at the prospect of bringing Genovese back to the States for trial on the murder rap. O'Dwyer then was on leave, serving as a general with the Foreign Economic Administration in Italy. Genovese was held by Dickey for 6 months. Finally, the investigator obtained the necessary papers to take him to New York and deliver him to the district attorney's office. No representative of any law enforcement agency was there to meet Dickey at the dock. A great deal of time had lapsed when Genovese was brought to trial before County Judge Samuel Leibowitz of Brooklyn on June 11, 1946. All but one of the witnesses had died or disappeared. The key witness, Peter Latempa, had been poisoned in Brooklyn Civil Prison on January 15, 1945. This was 7 days after Dickey had received his orders to bring Genovese back to New York. The Mafia at work. It certainly looked like it. Judge Leibowitz, who hates gangsters with passion, had to dismiss the indictment. He looked directly at Genovese in the courtroom and said, "I cannot speak for the jury, but I believe if there were even a shred of corroborating evidence, you would have been condemned to the chair." The judge's comment made no impression on Genovese's sneering facade. The gangster rejoined the underworld on the American side of the Atlantic, assuming immediate command of such big-name hoodlums as Frank Costello and Albert Boom Boom Anastasia, the tough man of the New York waterfront. Anastasia, a member of the Board of Trustees of Murder, Inc., had escaped a death house conviction in much the same manner as Genovese. He was finally executed by gangsters in a New York hotel barbershop last November. Genovese's boss, Lucky Luciano, was paroled from the New York State Penitentiary the year of Vito's return to the States. The parole, granted by Governor Dewey, never has been fully explained. Something was said about aid. Lucky gave American forces in the invasion of Sicily. It sounded like some of the same Mafia propaganda that had made Genovese a big hero of the Italian campaign. Luciano was banished to Italy under the terms of his strange parole. He immediately assumed command of the forces of Mafia, the secret Sicilian society in southern Italy. A strong liaison, especially in the dope smuggling racket, is said to exist between Luciano and Genovese now. Luciano is rated as the #1 international gangster, and Vito as #1 in this country. Genovese, the top target of federal investigators after the Kefauver Committee build-up, lost his American citizenship a few years ago. His deportation is still being sought. It was his estranged wife's testimony that really threw him, however. She described drunken parties, attended by Costello and Anastasia, at their mansion overlooking Sandy Hook Bay. She told of trips she made to Europe for the syndicate never with less than $100,000 in her purse. From $20,000 to $30,000 a week was entrusted to her care by the syndicate, she said, and the money was placed in safe deposit boxes in Atlantic Highlands and Red Bank, New Jersey, New York, Naples, and Switzerland. The divorce sought by Genovese was refused, and he was ordered to pay his wife $300 a week to keep her in the style to which she had become accustomed. Genovese, contending his wife had lied and that his actual income amounts to only about $125 a week, made a show of selling personal assets to satisfy back payments. A few mementos of the happy life Vito and Anna once enjoyed together were offered for sale in May 1953 at O'Reilly's Plaza Art Galleries in New York. They included an outsized double bed with a huge mirrored headboard, a peach satin spread, and matching pillow covers, a matching television set and piano in the Chinese motif, a Limoges dinner set, a sterling silver punch set, and a pair of 6-foot marble lamps formed like semi-nude girls. Genovese again was in the news last November. A few days after the murder of Anastasia, he and other high brass of the Mafia were caught in the now famous state police raid at the home of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York. Police described the meeting, attended by about 65, as a gangland convention. It possibly had been called as an aftermath of the Anastasia shooting. Then came his appearance before Senator John McClellan's committee, in which he took the Fifth Amendment 150 times, and finally the narcotics conspiracy indictment. Genovese, reputed to be worth $30,000, was charged with masterminding a ring of 37 men who smuggled narcotics into this country from Europe. Among those named with the 61-year-old Mafia chief were Vincent, the Chin Gigante, acquitted recently of an attempt on Frank Costello's life; Carmine Galante, suspect in the 1943 murder of anti-fascist editor Carlo Tresca; and John Ormento, a top narcotics man. Lucky Luciano was not one of those named, apparently, but law enforcement men who know are betting he was the man who started the narcotics on the way to the United States. Vito Genovese was hit again with another news article on the same day, and the momentum behind the mobsters' plotting and scheming was rapidly growing. The underworld is built on this kind of conniving, where mobsters do whatever it takes to take each other down. While people often talk about omerta, the code of secrecy, the truth is that corruption and the relentless pursuit of power override everything else. Climbing to the top means making deals in dark rooms with those who were once considered enemies. It is just part of the game. Anything else is a myth, a lie told to maintain the mysterious aura of gangsters that does not really exist. Vito was now being set up by Carlo Gambino, Frank Costello, and Charlie Luciano, the very men who would have killed anyone else for breaking the code. Frank Costello once had a man thrown out of a window for daring to violate this sacred code. Carlo Gambino and Charlie Luciano were just as ruthless, willing to kill anyone who betrayed the code. But when it benefited them, they felt justified in breaking it themselves. This is how the code and the game of organized crime truly work. The rules are flexible when power and survival are at stake. By February 1959, the situation for Vito Genovese and the world of organized crime was becoming increasingly tense. The Luciano family was now rebranded as the Genovese family, and Vito had finally achieved the power he long desired. However, it was not what he'd envisioned. The immense pressure was now squarely on his shoulders. Senator John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, began aggressively targeting Genovese and Mike Miranda, leading both men to question the outcomes of their past decisions: the assassination of Albert Anastasia, the deaths of other key mobsters, and now facing life imprisonment on narcotics charges. Despite these mounting challenges, Genovese still saw himself as a powerhouse, a man who had conquered even greater obstacles in the past. The backdrop of global tensions further complicated matters. In Cuba, Fidel Castro was consolidating power, creating uncertainty for organized crime, which now found itself clashing not only with newer generations, but also with governments at home and abroad. The Mafia's covert collaboration with the CIA, particularly involving figures like Carlos Marcello in the Southern Mafia, was a tightly kept secret, not even hinted at in the articles of the time. As you read the next article, you will begin to understand why organized crime felt the urgent need to take drastic action. Vito Genovese became a sacrificial lamb in their attempts to reshape the underworld. However, they underestimated the Kennedys. 4 years after this article, RFK and JFK would expose organized crime on national television, igniting a war that would ultimately end the Kennedy presidency and shake the foundations of the Mafia. They Get Away with Murder. By Jack Anderson, Parade Washington correspondent, Washington, D.C. On a quiet Friday morning on New York's West Side, racketeer Albert Anastasia sat drowsily in a barber chair awaiting a pomade. 2 men wearing scarves, one stout and sallow, the other slight and dark with a pencil mustache, stepped briskly into the barber shop, sprayed the gang lord with bullets, and fled. 11 people witnessed the slaying. A 13-state lookout was broadcast. 100 detectives search for clues. Yet, 16 months later, the killers are still at large and probably never will be caught. Gangland killings have an alarming habit of going unsolved. The professional triggermen who carry out the underworld's vengeance are able to get away with murder. They kill with grisly efficiency, often in crowded places, in brazen defiance of the police. Yet they are seldom arrested and even more rarely convicted. Of the 35 murders committed every day in the United States, all but 3 eventually end in arrest. Among the unsolved cases, however, are most mob murders. Law enforcement may know who is behind a killing and may even have a line on the torpedoes who did it. But this is not always enough to bring a successful prosecution. When charges are pressed, witnesses are terrified into silence, and vital evidence mysteriously disappears. Most gangland executioners come from the ranks of the Mafia, that shadowy, sinister secret society which sprang from the ancient feuds of hot-blooded Sicily. The Mafia has its own royalty of capos and dons, princes of the underworld who rule the rackets from coast to coast. The Kingpin is reputed to be Vito Genovese, who has amassed a $30 million fortune, yet declared only $6,000 in income on his 1954 tax return. Trained assassins. The Mafia has its own ruthless justice, its arbiters, who settle hoodlum disputes and pass sentences on squealers and double-crossers, and its enforcers, who carry out these sentences. These assassins are highly trained in their grim trade. Rarely do they kill on their own ground where they are known. They may be flown hundreds of miles to make a hit. The victim is spotted for them, and a getaway plan is worked out with split-second timing. All they have to do is pull the trigger, then fly back home like any other businessman. Arnold Baumann, chief counsel for the New York Crime Committee, which investigated the notorious Mafia convention at Appalachian, New York, told Parade, "There are 3 reasons why Mafia slayings are seldom solved. 1. The killers operate with professional skill, striking swiftly and leaving no evidence. 2. They flee across state lines, which complicates the problem for local police. And 3. Witnesses won't talk because they fear for their lives." Of the 65 Mafia chiefs who attended the Appalachian Crime Conference, according to Baumann, at least a dozen had been implicated in murders but had beaten the charges. The police could never find evidence or witnesses to convict them. Racket-busting Senator Estes Kefauver, as part of his sensational crime investigation in 1952-1953, ordered a side study into gang killings. He turned the project over to 2 of his ablest agents, Frank Ahern and Tom Cahill. Ahern later became San Francisco's police chief and was succeeded after his recent death by Cahill. Their findings were never made public, but Parade has been permitted to study their confidential file. From big city homicide squads, They collected case histories of unsolved racket murders. Most followed the same ugly pattern. In Tampa, Florida, gangster Jimmy Lumia was blasted with a shotgun by two imported gunmen, reputed to have arrived in Tampa less than 2 hours before the slaying. In Chicago, two men walked up to a parked car and pumped 6 shots through a closed window, killing driver John Golding instantly. The killers sped off in a getaway car with a stolen license plate. Gambler Patrick Hogan was killed at a casino outside St. Louis. Word got around, reported the police to the Kefauver Committee, that the body had been disposed of in an abandoned mine pit in southern Illinois. From New York to Los Angeles, New Orleans to Minneapolis, underworld figures have been murdered by assailants unknown. Their favorite weapons? The sawed-off shotgun and .45 revolver, both sure killers at short range. Mafia killer is caught. Occasionally, a mafia murder is solved. A confidential report from Houston, Texas, police claims, in 1949, a gang killing took place in our city. We were successful in tracing this killing to the mafia and apprehended the so-called head of the mafia in this state, Peter Duca, who was a parolee from the state of Pennsylvania. We had this man's parole revoked, and he was returned to Pennsylvania, where he later died of a heart attack. We also arrested the man responsible for the killing, Diego Carlina, who admitted being a member of the mafia. Such an admission is rare in police files. How fear of the mafia works on witnesses is also evident in case histories. Mobster Dan Stanton and his bodyguard Lou Dorman were playing cards in a Chicago tavern. 2 professional killers burst in through a side door. The Chicago police told Kefauver's agents both Stanton and Dorman were fatally shot in the back of the head and shoulders by blasts from a 12-gauge shotgun. Stanton was found in the rear of the premises behind the bar, indicating he was shot as he attempted to flee. Although this tavern had at least a dozen patrons at the time, no individual could be located who would admit witnessing the shooting or seeing the assailants. A trademark of mafia vengeance, designed to increase respect for its reign of terror, is to kill by the same method as the murder to be avenged. A Chicago racketeer, James D'Angelo, was found dead, trussed with rope, in the trunk of his automobile. 1 year later, the body of Onofrio Vitale, similarly trussed, was found in a city sewer. The rope was similar to that found in the shop of an earlier murder victim, Sam Gervais. All 3 men had been associated with a cheese company, known to be a front for criminal activities. To add to the mystery, a 4th cheese man, Nicholas DeJohn, was found murdered in San Francisco 3 years later. He had been strangled with a thin wire, and his body had been stuffed in a car trunk in the same manner used to dispose of D'Angelo. The mafia had been settling old scores. The DeJohn murder in 1947, says Chief Cahill, was the last gangland slaying in the Golden Gate City. A rare insight into the mafia's terroristic methods was furnished to the police by Carl Caramusa, a minor member who worked for a narcotics ring. The ring was thoroughly businesslike, employing a general manager, legal advisor, bookkeepers, and sales force. The drugs came from Marseille, France, to Havana, Cuba, and then were smuggled into the US at Tampa. Child-sacrificed Caramusa knew from personal experience the power of the mafia. His 11-year-old brother had been blasted to death with a shotgun, wielded by executioner Paul Catanzaro, as an act of terror against Caramusa's father. A host of shocked witnesses saw the small boy slain, but all were brutally frightened into silence. Even the Kansas City detective, Louis Olivero, who made the Catanzaro arrest, was later murdered for doing his duty. Determined to avenge his brother, Carl Caramusa bid his time until an opportunity came to finger key mafia members in Kansas City. He volunteered to be a government witness. As he testified in open court, the vicious Catanzaro appeared in the front row of the public seats and made subtle, threatening gestures. Caramusa knew his death warrant had been signed. After the trial, he went into hiding, changed his name, and began a new life with his wife and daughter in Chicago. He began to believe himself safe. But 3 years later, the Mafia caught up with him. He was sitting in his car, waiting for his family to join him for a wedding anniversary party. Suddenly, a shotgun roared. Caramusa's head was blown off. The Underworld Lords. What sort of men are the Underworld Lords who decree life and death for their minions? Typical is surly Mike Miranda, a Mafia mobster who appeared at a Senate rackets hearing last July. To all questions, he growled at the same answer: a Fifth Amendment plea. Counsel Robert Kennedy, asking questions from his files, cross-examined Miranda about some unsolved murders. On the Boccia murder, rapped Kennedy, you were very mad because Gallo had not been killed, and he came back and reported it to you, and you were furious because he had not poured gasoline on him and set him afire. Can you tell us about that? Miranda: I decline to answer. Kennedy: do you know anything about the murder of Peter LaTempa, who was the important witness against you, who was murdered in prison? Miranda: I decline to answer. Chairman John McClellan: do you place any value on human life above your own selfish interest? In other words, would you kill somebody just to make $1? Miranda: I decline to answer. Questioning Mafia ruler Vito Genovese, the chairman found it necessary to caution, I am a little apprehensive. I don't want anything divulged that will cause somebody to get murdered. Breaking the Mafia's power. What can be done to break the Mafia's power and stamp out its cold-blooded executions? Modern ease and speed of travel, which enables killers to leave their crimes far behind and confuse their trails with the intricacies of state law, is a chief factor handicapping the police. The modern manhunt is a nationwide affair. The first 91 criminals removed from the FBI's 10 most wanted list were all caught more than 900 miles from the scenes of their crimes. While the FBI does all in its power to aid local police, its hands are tied unless a federal crime has been committed. If a killer flees across state lines, the FBI can be invited to help hunt him down. The process of bringing the FBI into the case, however, is tangled with legal tape, for murder is still considered a local matter. Local police forces, once jealous of their rights, are now increasing cooperation not only with the FBI, but with one another. When Ahern and Cahill went to San Francisco, they set up an intelligence unit to work against the Mafia and invited other police departments to exchange information. Most of the big cities west of the Mississippi have now joined the network. After the Appalachian Convention, New York State Police Superintendent Frank McGarvey flew to San Francisco to study the system. Now New York has joined the information network. When a known racketeer leaves some other city for San Francisco, we are told about it, Cahill explained the system to Parade. After he arrives here, we know where he is, what he is doing, when he leaves, and where he is going. Cahill hopes all cities will join in the anti-mafia network, which is already helping to curb interstate murder. Stool pigeons wanted many remains to be done. There is still a sad lack of underworld intelligence. Arnold Baumann would like to see the FBI set up a counter-espionage unit against the underworld and infiltrate the Mafia, just as it has successfully infiltrated the Communist Party. Senator Kefauver told Parade, "We need stronger laws. A serious study should be made of what legislation is necessary to bring the federal government into the picture in gang killings of an interstate nature." To sum up, the answer to the Mafia and its killers lies in 1. Wider cooperation between police departments. 2. Better information about what the underworld is doing. And 3. Stiffer laws to combat interstate crime. Give FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover, that veteran of law enforcement, the last word. He warns, "Every offense unsolved and every violator at large afford encouragement to the veteran as well as to the novice in crime."